Well, good evening and welcome to the first International Women's Leadership Forum. I'm Cristina Talaco, the Vice President of the New South Wales Liberal Women's Council, and I'll start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community, paying respect to their elders, past and present. The Women's Council promotes the advancement of women in the Liberal Party, supporting females who wish to stand for leadership roles and public office. The International Women's Leadership Forum that we're launching tonight has the objective of creating a bridge connecting us with female leaders from other countries so we can exchange information, experiences, and solutions, because women's equal participation in political and public life are essential to ensure that the interests of women are taken into account in policy-making decisions. Unfortunately, worldwide data still shows that women are underrepresented. Only 25% of national parliamentarians are women. Only 4 countries have 50% or more women in parliament: Rwanda, Cuba, Bolivia, and the UAE. Women serve as heads of state in only 21 countries, and 119 countries have never had a female leader. At the current rate, parity will not be reached for another 130 years. This is why the work of the Women's Council under the leadership of our current president, Mary Lou Jarvis, and our group of dedicated women in the executive committee is so important, and why we wanted to create this forum and to connect us with these other international leaders. So tonight we have the great privilege of launching our forum with special guest, the Righteous Honourable Theresa May, former UK Prime Minister. I had the pleasure of hosting Theresa last year at a Coalition for Conservation webinar with our New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian, and I'm very, very grateful to Theresa for accepting the invitation to speak once again to an Australian audience and to share with us her knowledge and experience as one of the most accomplished female leaders in the global arena. I would also like to acknowledge some of our special guests who are physically here. As you can see, we are broadcasting live from Ernst & Young's office in Sydney, and we thank EY for sponsoring this event. Special thanks to Jomo Owuzu for his efforts in putting this together. So I'd like to welcome our special guest, the Honourable Bronwyn Bishop, the longest serving female in Parliament, at Parliament and former Minister for Defence. The Honourable Philip Ruddock, President of the Liberal Party in New South Wales and former Minister for Immigration. Natasha McLaren-Jones, Member of the New South Wales Legislative Council. The Honourable Bronnie Taylor, Minister for Mental Health, Regional Youth and Women. Former President of the New South Wales Liberal Party, Chris McDiven. The Mayor of Woollahra, Susan Wynne. Councillor Christine Kay, and of course, our Vice President of the New South Wales Liberal Party and President of the Liberal Women's Council, Mary Lou Jarvis. Can I also welcome all the Women's Council members of the executive who are here and the business women who are present tonight. Now, the webinar will be divided into 3 parts. Firstly, I'll have a conversation with Theresa, followed by a Q&A from the online audience. So if you are connected online, please type your questions in the Q&A box. And after that, I'll invite the audience in this room to ask questions directly to Theresa. Finally, I'll invite Mary Lou, and she'll do the closing remarks. Now, the webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be sent to those who registered. In order to make this the most of our time tonight, I'll skip all the introductions. Everybody knows who Theresa is, and her bio was circulated. And let me kick off by asking you a first question, Theresa. First of all, let me just say that the person who just connected is Emma, and she works with Theresa. So there's no 2 Theresas. So, Theresa, good morning, first of all. And thank you so much for joining us once again. You were first elected to Parliament in 1997. And you were one of only 5 women from the Conservative Party in the House of Commons. When did you realize that you wanted to pursue a political career? And as a female candidate at that time, did you face any particular challenges in your campaign or in your early days as a member of Parliament?
Well, can I first of all say it's a great pleasure to be joining you. I do wish I was there with you physically as I look out of my window at the snow falling here in the UK. But it's a great idea to form this leadership council. And I myself in the Conservative Party set up an organisation, co-founded an organisation called Women to Win, which was encouraging women to come into Parliament, to stand for Parliament, to take up public office. So it's great to see the work that you'll be doing in this area. Now, perhaps some people might think slightly strange, but I wanted to become a member of Parliament from quite a young age. When I was about 12, that was the first time I first thought of becoming a member of Parliament. But I always, and I did so because I wanted to make a difference, wanted to improve people's lives. I always thought that you had to accept in politics that there are a lot of people who want to become members of Parliament who don't make it, either because obviously the numbers are greater than the number of seats, and then of course the electoral cycle can sometimes be unkind, and somebody who's tried very hard and would be good just doesn't get elected because the cycle goes against the party. So I think you have to recognise that it's a hard grind in that sense, that you might not actually make it. But I think my key thing is if you persevere, I would say that people who persevere genuinely do make it through. Did I ever I don't think I ever encountered what I would consider to be a sort of sexism or that sense of attitudes that I found difficult. But then from a very early stage, when I was going to be selected to fight a seat, always took the view that if I didn't win that selection, I should never say to myself that it was because I was a woman. I should always ask myself, was my speech not very good? Was there a question I didn't answer very well? Is there a topic area I need to mug up on? What can I do better? Not, oh, well, of course it was because I was a woman, but what can I do better in order to make sure that I get there? The one area where I do think I encountered a different sort of approach was when, as Prime Minister, I was negotiating Brexit. And a lot of people, particularly on the Conservative Party, wanted to see a negotiation that was about thumping the table, slamming the door shut, walking away, sort of aggressive attitudes. In fact, because I'd spent years negotiating with the EU before I came into politics, you get a negotiation by sitting down and talking. Sometimes you have to walk away, but you have to use that sparingly, because if you do it all the time, it doesn't have an impact.
Very well. It's interesting to hear that you didn't feel like that was anything to do with gender, and you always thought of yourself as equal, and that the gender issue didn't play any part. But by the same token, I know that you mentioned this organization that you created, and you're a co-founder called Women to Win. You said it focuses on promoting more women, more MPs in the Conservative Party. And I was reading that at the time where you started this organization, there were only 17 Conservative women that were MPs, which was about 9% of the party. But now there's 87 women MPs. So that's an enormous difference, making up about a quarter now of the Conservatives. So what do you think has been the biggest factor leading to this significant increase in women's involvement in the Conservative Party?
Well, I think the key thing was that the party took this seriously as an issue. So when I became the first female party chairman back in 2002, and I started looking at our whole selection process, and we discovered that our selection, and we brought in an occupational psychologist and various experts to look at our selection process. And we discovered that there was some inadvertent bias in it, in that it was very much based on the ability to make a tub-thumping speech. And by and large, not necessarily, this is a generalization, but by and large, the men tend to be better at that than the women. There was no attempt to test the listening skills of the candidate and the ability to just have, if you like, a normal conversation about politics. And we changed our selection process. That helped to change the approach the party was taking. We also then, when Women to Win was created, when David Cameron became leader, he took this issue seriously, and we set up what was called the A list, so that for any selection in a constituency, they had to select from a list which was gender balanced. They might not get a gender balance in their the final numbers they interviewed, but the list they selected from was gender balanced. Because if you get 200 CVs and only 20 of them are women, then the chances are you're more likely to select a man. But actually, if you've got 50-50, 100 CVs that are female, 100 male, then the chances of a woman coming through are greater. So we changed our selection processes, and I think that was, and Women to Win played a huge role in that as well. And crucially, Women to Win has done the thing that I think often we women are our own worst enemies in this area, because I think there are lots of women who would make great members of parliament, great members of legislatures at different levels. They think they'd like to do it, but they wait for somebody to ask them. Whereas a man in that position just goes ahead and puts himself forward. And what Women to Win did was to say to women, come forward, we're asking you, come forward, and then we will give you that help and support, which, for some might not be much, for others, they might not have much experience of public speaking. So they're given that support, that mentoring, and just helped on their way. So I think changing the way the party developed this and then providing that support for women were the two things that have made a difference.
So do you feel at times that there's more pressure for women in politics to conform to a certain type of behavior than men? I mean, you just mentioned that we're less forward than men.
Well, I think the one thing I would say is that, and I think this goes for business as well as politics, don't think, for any woman, don't think you have to fit a sort of male role model, a stereotyped male role model. Be yourself. I think this is crucially important for women. So don't think that you've got to behave like the men. And one of the messages I consistently give to business people as well as in politics is that very often women may approach a job or a task in a different way, but that doesn't mean it's not as equally as valid as the way the man would approach it. And she's not going to get just as good results or sometimes better results. It's just different. And so that thinking that you often see in business and in politics, as I say, that there's a certain way of doing things, I think we have to break that sort of mold that has come and show that you can approach issues in different ways and with different styles of working. You get good results just the same. So you don't always have to do it in the same way.
Yeah. So what do you think are the biggest challenges for women nowadays then?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges, and sadly this is an issue that has grown up in recent years, just at the point where we were really certainly we're seeing in the UK, these numbers of women coming forward. What we've also seen is the use of social media to bully, harass and threaten parliamentarians and candidates. Not exclusively women, but predominantly women are the victims of this. And sadly, that does mean that some women don't go forward or perhaps leave the political arena because of that. And I think for a woman, sometimes it's not just about herself, it's about the family as well, and a concern about the wider impact of this bullying and harassment. But of course, it is difficult. And here in the UK, we had back in 2016, the murder of a female member of parliament, Jo Cox, who was a Labour member, who was widely respected, a relatively new member, widely respected across the House. That sort of reminds people that sadly there are those people out there who will, that was from a right-wing extremist. So it was there was a particular reason behind that, or what caused that individual to do that. But the message generally today that social media can be used in a very harmful way, particularly against women in politics, is difficult. This is something we have to deal with. It's something that parliamentarians here in the UK consistently raising with government, and government looking obviously at the whole question of online harms and how social media platforms operate.
Very much so. So, Theresa, you were also the Minister for Women and Equalities. And so what were your priorities then? What was the agenda during that time? What did you perceive as the most important thing to do for women at that time?
Well, one of I was looking at some of the issues around what I call social injustice. So one of the big areas that I did work on that is still being worked on, I started as Home Secretary to do work in this area when I was Minister for Women and Equalities. I'd done it in opposition, carried on as PM, and now this government is taking some work forward, which is in the whole area of domestic abuse. Now we know that it's not only women who suffer from domestic abuse, men suffer from domestic abuse as well. Sometimes women are perpetrators of domestic abuse, but predominantly the figures show the majority of the victims and survivors of domestic abuse are women. And so we're introducing a new Domestic Abuse Act in the UK. We did a lot of work on that, work on stalking, some of these issues that were known about but weren't at the forefront of people's thinking, trying to bring some of those issues forward. But also I set up a Women's Business Council to work to see how we could encourage more women in business field. Here in the UK, we'll often see women on boards of companies now. There was some very good work done to do that, but very often they're non-executive directors. It's still quite difficult for women to come through the corporate pipeline, often because they tend to be working not in finance and operating areas, but in areas like HR, government affairs. And so that's where I come to those looking at appointments, don't think you've got to come through one particular route to get to somewhere. Look at the skill set somebody has, not just at whether they've been a finance officer.
Right. You have criticized, before we're talking about business, but you've criticized the absence of women in many company boardrooms. Have you seen any positive changes recently, or both at political but also at corporate level, that have improved female representation?
We've certainly seen a real effort to improve female representation at board level in companies here in the UK. But I think the problem, and it's rather like the issue we see in politics, is that you will have a sort of campaign or piece of work done to encourage this, but you can't take your foot off the pedal. You can't sort of suddenly say, right, we've got X number there, therefore it's okay forever. Sadly, we have to keep the messages going and keep this being done. We all want the day when actually we're not having to campaign or fight or work for more women to be represented in politics or in senior levels in business, when it's just natural, when people don't think about whether there's a man or a woman in front of them, but do think about the skill set that the individual has. So we've made progress, but there's still progress to be made. And one of the things that I was always an advocate of, that we were able to introduce in government, was the right to request flexible working, for example, and shared parental leave, so that when a baby is born to a couple, actually the man might have time off. There's a certain set of number of weeks set for the woman, but after that they can share their parental leave, so the woman can go back to work and the man can be off. It isn't used that much, but it's gathering use. And the key thing I thought there was, you don't want an employer with a young man and a young woman in front of them with equal skill sets to think, as I'm sure they have done, I'll take the man because the woman might get pregnant and go off and have a baby. Actually, if the employer doesn't know, he or she doesn't know whether the man or the woman's going to take time off when the baby's born, that equalizes things.
Yeah, well, on that subject, so I'll now start asking questions from the online audience. And there is a question here that arrived this morning from Agline Passion. She's asking, how did you balance being a mom and a leader?
Oh, well, actually, I'm not a mum. Sadly, my husband and I don't have any children. So I didn't have that balance to do. I have colleagues. I can think of one of my former cabinet colleagues, Caroline Spellman, who's no longer in the House. She retired from the House, but she had 3 children. She was just hugely well organized. I think that was the key thing. And she did have support. I think most people in balancing politics and will have to have some level of support for the family, but you just need to be very disciplined and very well organized. I think that's what I've seen. But it does affect family life. We have to be honest about that. I think Caroline used to take her children along to events that she did in the constituency. So they became part of the her work. They were understood what she was about as well through that experience.
Thanks. And from Natalie Baini, she's asking, do you feel that the most pressing issues facing the world today might have been managed differently? Had there been a greater proportion of female leaders across the globe?
That's a very interesting question, because I think certainly at one stage in the looking, for example, at the COVID pandemic, there was some evidence in the early stages that countries run by women did seem to be getting some better results than others. But look, I think one thing I would say, and if we take COVID as an example, I think one of the things that surprised me is the lack of international cooperation in dealing with COVID. There's been some cooperation on vaccines, but rather than people sitting down and saying, what seems to be the best way of dealing with this, we've all retreated inside our own borders and dealt with it in our own ways. And maybe if there'd been more female leaders, there would have been more a sense of let's actually just get together and work out how the best way to approach this is. Obviously, countries are different, have different circumstances, but there just hasn't been that sense of this is a global pandemic, let's get together at that international level.
True. Sarah Felix saying your resilience and composure throughout Brexit negotiations was impressive. How did you find your strength to keep pushing through so many challenges then, particularly under the spotlight?
Well, I think it's first of all, actually, when you're in those positions, I think it's easy to find that strength. But I've always said that the key thing is to keep your main goal in sight, because there will always be knocks along the way, but you have constantly to be thinking about what it is you are trying to achieve. And if you believe in what you're trying to achieve, if you really believe that that's the right thing for the country, then that gives you the strength to carry on through.
Theresa, there's a few questions on Brexit, so I'm going to put them all into one, I suppose. It's easier. But what do you see as the biggest economic challenge for the UK post-Brexit? And now that it happened, it's a reality. How do you see the UK's prospects as of this year?
Well, I think the challenge that the UK is having to cope with at the moment, that many of our businesses, our farmers are having to cope with, is the fact that there are non-tariff barriers to trade with the European Union. It is no longer seamless in the way that it used to be. So there are extra customs documents to be filled in, to be dealt with, and this all brings extra cost to our businesses. So businesses are having to adjust to that at the moment. And also, if there's no tariffs on trade with the European Union, provided rules of origin rules are met. And so we have businesses in the UK whose business is actually bringing in goods from outside the European Union, and then they were exporting them into the rest of the European Union without tariffs. Now they have tariffs, so their business model is having to change. So we've got quite a few businesses that are having to look at how they operate and change their business models. There's then the wider challenge for the UK of negotiating trade deals with the rest of the world. Obviously, we've, as we said when I was PM, and it's I think we've now formally started that process. We've been very interested in joining the CPTPP. So that negotiation hopefully will start to get going. So there's that element. How will the UK, what about UK prospects? The challenge is that, of course, it's very difficult to separate the impact of Brexit on the economy from the impact of COVID on the economy. The UK has been sharply hit by COVID in our economy because we are such a service-based economy. And obviously our hospitality industry, our tourism industry, our services have suffered significantly as a result of the action that's been taken to deal with COVID. I think, however, this does present us with an opportunity. It's an opportunity that I think we will want to take with other countries around the world, notably through our presidency of the G7 this summer, which is to say, how can we all build back better after COVID? We know we've got to deal with issues like climate change. So actually making sure our economy is growing in a way that is commensurate with dealing with climate change is important. But this gives us that sort of opportunity, if you like, to stand back and say, what should the economy of the future look like? And how can we put that in place and ensure that we can develop post-COVID? And in our case, obviously, adjusting to those new Brexit arrangements.
And you are a passionate advocate for the environment. You've always been very into conservation. And in 2019, under your leadership, the UK became the first country to legally commit to a net zero target by 2050. Do you feel there's a role for women in helping to achieve sustainability through politics or through business?
Yes, I do. And I think, in a sense, again, a huge sweeping generalization, but women will probably have a somewhat greater interest in the future preservation of the planet because of their concern for future generations, for their children and their children's children, and what they will be growing up in and the sort of world they'll be living in. So I think there is a huge role for women here. And one of the two things I would say about dealing with climate change is the first is that too often in the past, it's been presented as you can either deal with climate change or you can grow the economy. And there's tended to be a political separation on that. Very often, more conservative parties would take the view that obviously the economy was more important, and others would take the view that the environment was more important. But this is wrong. You can deal with climate change and grow your economy. It's about what I was just saying. It's about how you address that business, how you develop the economy, what is the economy of the future. So I think that's a really important issue for us to be looking at. But alongside that, we're going to deal with climate change if people in their own everyday lives also make changes. And here I think there's a huge role for women in ensuring that then their families are doing simple things like not having single-use plastic, all those sorts of wider issues about our environment that just help day by day to improve matters. Issues like that, I think, are hugely important. This isn't just a big issue, it's something we can all make a difference about.
Thanks, Theresa. Veronica Hope is saying, please forward our thanks from the Hunter Valley to Ms. May for taking the time to address this audience, because it's an extremely valuable resource for regional women like myself, and who find her prime ministership inspirational. And the question from her, what has been your experience in converting progressive seats to conservative? What are making huge headway in very safe Labour seats? So any comparable examples would be great to hear.
Well, of course, here in the UK, we have had as a Conservative Party success in turning some of those Labour seats into Conservative seats. A small number in 2017, a large number in 2019. That was largely actually because of one issue. It was because of Brexit. It was because there were Labour voters who'd voted for Brexit who saw that the Labour Party wasn't going to deliver it for them and that the Conservative Party would deliver it for them. So now we have the challenge of holding on to those seats in the future. And I think one of the key issues for some of those what were strong Labour seats is that they're often in parts of the country which I would say feel left behind. They feel that in UK terms, London and the South East has done very well economically, thank you, and hugely economically dynamic parts of the country, and people living in that part of the country have done very well, but elsewhere has been left behind. So actually the policies that we adopt for those areas to help lift them in economic terms, in terms of jobs and skills, are hugely important in appealing to those voters and showing that we understand their concerns and have their interests at heart. And I think that's what's important. I called it, when I was Prime Minister, a country that works for everyone. Boris Johnson calls it levelling up, but actually the issue is the same. It's about making sure that all parts of the country have those have that economy, the jobs that actually enables people to feel confident about their futures. And then I'm just on something else I'll say about seats and winning seats. I've always been a great believer that actually work on the ground is absolutely crucial. In general elections, of course, what the party is saying overall for the country is important, but actually you don't get there unless you put the work in on the ground as well.
So before I invite our guests here at EY to ask questions, just one last question from me. I'd like to know from you if you see any opportunities now with Brexit that could enhance our partnership with the UK, Australia and the UK. Where do you see those opportunities now?
Well, I think there will be opportunities. I mean, the obvious one is trade and a trade deal. And as I say, or possibly us being part of CPTPP. The other sort of levelling factor that's come in, of course, is in the immigration, that we now have a set of immigration rules that apply to everybody, rather than having that free movement from the European Union and then a set of rules for people outside the European Union. But there are also other areas where we cooperate very much. Of course, the Five Eyes cooperation on security has always been very important to us. And certainly there are a number of areas where I was working when obviously Malcolm Turnbull was most of the time my opposite number in Australia. And we had a real interest in looking at some of these issues around security and cyber. And then if I just mention one other topic where there is a difference for Australia because of your proximity, and that is China. And the issue of future international relations with China is hugely important for the world. We're seeing obviously a new administration in the US, but probably going to take a very similar approach to China from the previous administration. And some real questions around Europe, obviously doing some work on trade deal with China. Some real issues for us on how we deal with China. And I think the United Kingdom working with Australia and looking at that, as I say, you have a different circumstance because of your geographical position with China from us. But I think us working together on an issue like that could be important.
Thank you, Theresa. I'm just going to offer now for anyone who's here to ask questions. And there's one from Philip Reddick. I'll just give the mic.
Well, thank you very much for your outstanding leadership. I appreciate the observations you've made tonight. I'm not recognised as being an advocate for women. But in Australia, as Attorney General, I appointed more women to the High Court than any other Attorney General in Australia's history. The first woman I appointed was Susan Crennan, who said to me what you said tonight. She said, "I don't want you to claim that you are appointing a woman to this role on the basis of her gender. I want to be satisfied that I have been appointed because I am the best candidate in the field." And you endorse that observation, and it's one that I commend. What I was particularly interested in was your statement about the way in which the Conservative Party has sought to enlarge the field of candidates, female candidates, from whom they can choose. When I first stood, 43 years I was in the Parliament, 30 candidates stood, they were all male. It's changed, but if we were going to get panels that had 50% female, it would be a challenge. To restrict the numbers nominating so that you could have 50%, I think would present a challenge. I'd like to hear how you were able to do it.
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you very much. And well done for appointing so many female judges, because one of the challenges we do see is that if people don't see people like them in those sorts of positions, then they tend to think that they can't get there and they can't do it. So that's excellent. And yes, it is important for a woman that she doesn't feel she's just been appointed because she's a woman, but that her skill set has been recognised. Now, how did we do it? Well, it was tough. The party, there were elements of the party that didn't like the process that was put in place to encourage women to come forward, but it needs very strong leadership from the top to say this is definitely the way that we are going. And we spent an awful lot of time working with different constituency associations here. So there were the chairman of the candidates committee at the party level. sadly the now late Shireen Ritchie and others would go and actually sit down and spend quite a lot of time talking with associations about the importance of looking at a diverse range of candidates. And they would talk to them about the nature of their constituency. And certainly one of the issues we found here was that constituency associations very often didn't really understand the nature of the constituency in terms of the sort of people who voted Conservative. They knew who their Conservative Party members were, but they didn't understand the generality of Conservative voters. And so sort of talking to people about what made up the constituency and therefore what the constituents would be looking for in a member of Parliament was an important part of the process, as well as establishing this concept of what we called the A-list. It's not used any longer, we've moved on from that, but it just gave this kickstart. And it meant that people who were on the candidates list had to go through some separate interviews. There was a group of us, I sat on that group for a number of years, who came together, who were appointed by the leader, who went through everybody on the list and made decisions about whether they should be on the A-list or not. And it was about numbers of, yes, it was about being gender balanced, but it was also actually about bringing some other diversity in as well, people with some different backgrounds. I'm not sure I should say this to a former Attorney General, but we have an awful lot of lawyers in Parliament. And sometimes it's good to have people with more business experience, with experience in the public sector, experience working for non-governmental organisations, just that breadth of experience. So we did that at the same time as looking at the gender balance. But it took a clear move from the party leadership to say, no, this is important, this is what we've got to do, and this is the way we're doing it. But behind that list, there was all that work with associations at local level, talking to them about their constituencies, about the sort of person they needed to have representing them. And of course, as I said, the different selection process too also helped.
Thank you. We've got a few more.
Hello, my name's Penny George. I'm the Vice President of the New South Wales Division here. There's a few things we have in common beyond being female and loving Conservative politics is that I have type 1 diabetes, and I know, understand that you do as well, and I often looked at you in senior leadership positions, obviously as Prime Minister, thinking, how do you do it? How did you do it? How did you manage your sugars and your life and the balance? And I know that's a very personal question to ask, but it's what I've always wanted to know from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And it's, as you know, I think my main answer would be just, as you know, by being disciplined in as much as possible. Everybody had to know. So that the whole team knew that there were certain things that I had to do as a type 1 diabetic. So simple things like making sure when I went on a trip somewhere or I was going to have a meal somewhere, that we always knew what the menu was in advance. Everybody knew that before I went into that big dinner, I would go and inject. So there were simple things that the team had to know so that the processes around me adapted to my type 1 diabetes as well. And then just, as I say, just by being disciplined, I found a huge boost was actually using I wear an Abbott Libre, Freestyle Libre monitor sensor. So being able to have that made a huge difference to being able to just monitor on that regular basis going forward. So, and you know, we all know it tends to be a percentage game for us, doesn't it? You don't get it right, absolutely right every day. But you learn from those experiences where you don't get it right, and you just have to feed that into your behavior and your calculations.
Thanks, Theresa. Got one more, Jackie.
Hello.
Oh.
Hi. Hi, Theresa. I'm just wondering if you could sit back knowing what you know now and having had the incredible career, what advice would you give your 12-year-old self going into politics?
Gosh. I think it would be something around just being a little more confident in myself going forward. As I said, I think the problem often for women is feeling that they almost have to be asked. Somebody has to tell them, say to them, look, I think you could really do this. And sort of having that confidence of feeling that you know you can do it, and therefore going forward, I think is important. So I think probably it will be about something around that. I mean, it is difficult. It's that age-old thing, isn't it? That if you've got a job with 10, it requires 10 different skills or qualifications. And there's a man and a woman looking at the job, the man has 5, the woman has 5. The man will tend to say, I've got 5, therefore I can do the job. And the woman will tend to say, I've only got 5, therefore I can't do the job. So I think it's about that confidence of being willing, not being, arrogant, but just having a little more confidence in oneself in going forward.
Thanks, Theresa. Now we have Jackie and then Ron.
Thank you so much for addressing us. It's excellent. My name is Jackie Munro. I'm involved with Women's Council here. I heard a great quote the other day that conservative women are not feminist icons, they're just very competent women. And I'm wondering if you think that the right side of politics needs to do a better job at promoting the success of its own women, or if we should just be letting women do their thing and making it a normal part of our party processes and the public sphere.
Well, I think almost it's a bit of both. I think I caught all of the question, but it's of course we want this to be a normal part of our processes, and we want it to be as natural for a woman to be selected to stand for Parliament and become a member of Parliament as for a man to do that. Partly that's about numbers. The larger the number of women you have, the more natural it becomes, the more natural it's seen to be, and therefore the more people don't think about is it a man or a woman, but actually just look at the skill set. But I think we do need to promote what we're doing around women and be seen to show women in politics. And there's 2 reasons for that. First, if we're going to encourage other women, if we're going to encourage girls today to be interested in coming into political careers in the future, they need to see what women are doing in politics, and they need to feel that that's somebody that they can identify with, and that is something for them. And also, actually, I mean, there was some work done by the Fawcett Society here in the UK. It was a while ago now, but it showed at the time that a woman candidate got, there was a higher turnout in the vote when there was a woman candidate. And I'm not sure what the reasoning behind that is, except that possibly there are more female voters who will go out and vote. They feel there's somebody like them on the candidates list, on the ticket, on the ballot. So I think there's an electoral reason for wanting to show what we're doing for women, as well as the very good reason of encouraging more women within the party. But we want to be able for it not to be a sort of, oh no, you're promoting the women again, aren't you? But just, this is good for us as a party. Let's do it because it's overall good for us.
Thanks, Theresa. There's one from Bronwyn at the front. And Christine.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn Bishop. Thank you for your address. Can I ask a world question? Should President Xi move to take over Taiwan, bearing in mind that the President of Taiwan is a very capable woman, whose inauguration I was pleased to attend, what would be, do you think, the attitude of Britain to take action against China in that event? What would you have done as Prime Minister, and what do you think Boris Johnson would do as Prime Minister?
Goodness me, that is a really tough question, but I think it's a question that we all need to be thinking about, given the attitude that we have seen from China in recent times. the first question, of course, would be what would be the approach of the United States if that were to happen, because it could be that others across the world will find ourselves, if you like, caught up in an approach that was taken by the United States. I don't know what Boris Johnson would do in that situation. And if I'm honest, I think it's difficult to say what I would have done in that situation, because you can't say, when you're Prime Minister, you have so much more information, and B, you can only look at a circumstance in the time in which it takes place, because you have to take account of various other issues around it. We're not just looking at that issue. But I think if it were to happen, I think the world will be in a very dangerous place.
Christine? Sorry, someone had their hand up. Yeah, thank you.
I thought I was going to ask a difficult question, but after that, I think it's going to be quite easy. You've obviously had an enormous amount of success across your career, but I'm really interested to know what you think is your one failure that kind of keeps you up at night, that you chew over, and to understand what you learned from that.
Well, I won't say it's something that keeps me up at night. I mean, I think what most people would identify as a failure, and the thing that frustrates me, is that I didn't actually deliver Brexit. I had a deal that I thought was a good deal. Sadly, what I learned from that was that obviously there were people in my own party who wouldn't vote for that. And it got to be both sides at the end, but at the beginning it was those people who had voted for Brexit, had campaigned for Brexit, then when presented with a Brexit deal wouldn't vote for it, which was deeply frustrating. And what happened, of course, was that in the difficult circumstance, in the numbers that we had in the House of Commons, it meant that both sides, those who wanted a second referendum and staying in, and those who wanted to leave on their terms and only on their terms, both then sort of played off each other. And if one side appeared to get something, then the other side had to have something. And we got into this horrible situation in Parliament where nobody would vote for anything. You know, the UK Parliament on several occasions was given opportunities to vote for different options in relation to Brexit and could never vote for any of them. So hence, change of leadership and an election was the only solutions. So I think my regret was that I didn't manage to persuade sufficient of my parliamentary colleagues to vote for Brexit. I think one of the challenges for any leader is the challenge of both doing the job as Prime Minister and at the same time keeping in touch and talking to and being with your parliamentary colleagues, who are the ones you're expecting to go through the lobby and vote for what you're doing. I think getting that balance right can be quite difficult with all the stresses and strains there are of the issues you're dealing with as Prime Minister. But perhaps from an earlier stage, I should have spent a little more time talking to and discussing with some of my parliamentary colleagues who I assumed would vote for Brexit because that's what they wanted. And when it came to it, they didn't.
Thanks, Theresa. There's two questions that popped up on the Q&A that are very interesting. One is from Penny Graham. She's asking you, what answers do you have to address the very real disparity in superannuation between women and men, and especially women who are frequently juggling time as carers?
It's interesting. I obviously don't have a detailed knowledge of your sufficiently detailed knowledge of your situation in Australia to be able to comment on that. I mean, we have put some sort of processes in place to help women in the UK who perhaps took time out of work and therefore weren't making their national insurance contributions over periods of time, to try and get a rather better situation in relation to pension funds. But I think this is a difficult area. We used to have very good systems in the United Kingdom, aside from the state pension, where pensions related to work were on one particular system with pension funds and the accumulation over your time in the period of work into a pension fund. The Labour Party changed that through some of the new rules and some of the rules the accountants brought in relation to pension funds, which means that we're now going much more on to the individuals building up their own fund through contributions, as a separate fund, not as a collective in the same way. Equalising age is a difficult challenge. We've got a group of women here in the United Kingdom who are very exercised about the fact that effectively they now have to work longer because there has been this move to equalise the age at which pensions kick in for men and women in the UK, but also to extend the point at which pensions kick in because people are living longer and working and will have to work longer. And that's just a fact of life. But we did take some steps to ensure that there were opportunities open to women who had time out of the workplace to be able to build up their contributions such that they were able to take their have a greater equality in their pensions.
Thank you. There's also a question here from Melina Rowan. She's saying the UK Conservative Party has produced 2 female prime ministers, whereas the Australian and the US equivalents haven't. Do you have a view on why the UK achieved this where other countries have not?
Well, it's interesting, and of course, the fact that the United States now has a female vice president in Kamala Harris is a hugely important step forward, I think, for them. This is an interesting question, and I will tell you, I had a conversation. It's quite a while back now with Julia Gillard about who obviously has been doing some work on sort of female leadership, and it just suddenly struck me that I just wonder in the UK. The fact that we have had a queen on the throne for a very long period of time may just make us a little more willing to see women in positions of authority and positions of power, if you like. Now, I don't know, I'm not a psychologist, I don't know whether that is anything to do with it, but I think perhaps there's just that sense that there hasn't been the sense that those positions are always held by men. Although it is interesting, of course, that it is the Conservative Party that has produced female prime ministers. Many people would have said that if you were going to have a first female prime minister in the UK, the chances were it would be much more likely to be Labour. But actually, it's Conservatives and the Labour Party, apart from a temporary period when they were having a leadership election and had a stand-in leader, they haven't produced a female leader yet, let alone a female prime minister.
That's true. We've only got time for one more question. What do you consider to be your most significant achievement to date?
Gosh, well, I think one of the things that always pops into my head when people ask me that question is something I actually did as Home Secretary, but I'm carrying on working on, which was introducing the Modern Slavery Act. And just start trying to raise people's awareness to the fact that slavery still takes place in the world today and in our countries. It's not just something that happens elsewhere. It will be happening in Australia, it's happening in the UK. So I think that's one of the key things I would point to. In terms of the thing that might make the biggest difference collectively in the future, I think probably setting that net zero emissions target in legislation. And hopefully the UK leading the way in doing that is important.
Thanks, Theresa. We're running out of time, so I'd really like to now invite the New South Wales Liberal Women's Council President, Mary Lou Jarvis, who's here, and she's a tireless advocate for women. She'll do the final remarks and a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you to Theresa. What a fantastic night it was here tonight with you, having you here speaking to us and sharing some of your insights. And before I talk about what we have in common, I will talk to some of the things that you've given me as an example that I think we need to pursue. And I'm addressing these comments to the people on the state executive and our Mr. President that's here. And that is that idea of perhaps making sure that we have 50% women put forward. You have women to win. We have more women for local government. We have more women for parliament. So we have those sort of programs, but I think that's a really interesting concept. And I think it's good for us to perhaps look at that. And I'll certainly be suggesting we do that at our next Women's Council meeting. But I just want to also say about what you've said tonight has highlighted to me what we have so much in common between the UK and here in Australia. A lot of us here, and I say all the women and a couple of the men in the room, but also those people that are out in Zoom land watching you, so much gratitude for what you've been able to do and present to us tonight. I think one of the things that we can really take away from this is, as I say, what we have in common. And some of the things that you've talked about, as you talked about being the chairman of the organisation or party, we had our first female president back in 1982, and she's here in the room. So it is actually, in some ways we've been ahead of you, but in some ways I think we've got a lot to learn. Your comments about making sure that you have a good selection of women when you're looking at corporate positions. I mean, Julie Bishop as Foreign Affairs Minister, I'm sure you met Julie in her time as Foreign Affairs Minister, took a position it was almost quite novel and actually caused a bit of angst at the time for some people, where she had a number of people that would come before her for diplomatic posts, and she'd say no until the list had 50% women and 50% men. She wasn't going to look at it. So that has sort of filtered down. And to the fact that this week our Attorney General in New South Wales, Mark Speakman, there was a newspaper article about the fact that we now have approaching 50%, almost 50% women that have been appointed to the judiciary. So we're making progress, we're making inroads. But I love some of your comments about, and I'm just going to go through them because I had to make notes of things. I mean, the Modern Slavery Act, I remember Amanda Vanstone as Immigration Minister being very concerned about slavery. And I wonder whether the issue about slavery, like the fact that there are 2 female Prime Ministers of the UK, has to do with the fact that regrettably slavery affects women perhaps disproportionately to men in terms of sex slavery. And I remember Amanda hunting down brothels and the like to try and find these women to protect them. We have other things that you mentioned. I mean, obviously the participation, jobs and skills. Pleasingly, before COVID, Australia's the economic participation of women in the workforce was greater than it had ever been. So, as I say, there are a lot of similarities, but we've got lots to do. Look, thank you so much. You wouldn't perhaps know this, but to many women here in Australia, and we're actually more women than men, which might suggest why we need to have more women in Parliament. But when you were elected to Parliament, I don't tweet. I have so much to do in this role in terms of Facebook and LinkedIn. So when I tweet, it's for a really good reason. And as you were talking tonight, I went back and I saw 16th of July, 2016, you'd just been appointed Prime Minister 3 days later. And you had on that day, you might remember this, Theresa May's first 3 days as PM, arriving at number 10, calling POTUS, who was then presumably President Obama, because I'm seeing a few months later, I'm talking about the civility between the transfer, would you believe, of President Obama to President Trump. Well, we know how that ended. But you, on the other hand, are just getting about your daily business. On that day, you called POTUS, but you met with police officers. And also quite strategically, I suspect, met with Nicola Sturgeon in terms of the Scottish issues that I recall happening around that time. So we have followed your path since, before 2016, but we are following it always still. And one thing that you've actually still continued to push for, which I really think that as women we can be very grateful, is the issue of domestic violence. And you might be interested that you might be looking to what's going on, but we've looked to Scotland in relation to coercive control. We worked last year on a policy to introduce coercive control because murders predominantly start with some sort of coercive control. So there's something, all these issues affect all women all over the world. Also, the other thing, of course, which Penny mentioned, diabetes, and the work you continue to do on that is commendable. What I love, though, is the fact that you told about us having to have confidence, and you have given us an enormous amount of confidence tonight, and we thank you very much for making the time, especially early in the morning, to come and speak to us. So from all of us here in Australia, we want to say, when this lasted pandemic finishes, you've got to come to Australia and we'll actually give you a glass of wine or take you to the beaches, give you some oysters if you like. Just so you know, I was going to send you some flowers today, but we weren't 100% sure where you'd be. So I thought I wouldn't waste the money in case you didn't get them. But what I will send you is the Women's Council Guide of 2021, which will show you the highlights that we've achieved here in Australia and New South Wales, and a Women's Council pen. So that will hopefully find its way to you. Better than flowers, because I feel that somebody else would. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You've had a taste of the level of energy of our Women's Council President, Theresa. But thanks again on behalf of the Women's Council for sharing your knowledge with us. It's always a pleasure to hear your insights. I'm sure we all feel very invigorated with your words. And I'm actually looking forward to seeing you in the UK for COP26, fingers crossed. And thanks to all of you who joined us here in person and all of those who join us online. We hope to see you soon again. Hopefully now you can participate more often in our international forums and definitely at the Liberal Women's Council events. We'll be sending you invitations. Thanks everyone and have a fantastic night.
Bye.